Facebook just launched another massive open source project specifically geared at CSS, and the goal of this project is to overhaul how you write CSS in a similar way to how React overhauled how you write your front end JavaScript. This library is really good for large scale enterprise projects, and in this video, I'm going to be covering everything you need to know about this library to see if it's something you want to use and to see the benefits and drawbacks of it. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name is Kyle and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner, and this StyleX library is actually really cool in what it does. So if we kind of go through the history of CSS real quick, just starting with like React when it first came out, everybody was writing CSS just in CSS files, importing those into your project, and you had to deal with the cascade, overwriting things, and it was really hard to remove old CSS, and a lot of times if you had too many classes and specificity problems, it became hard to overwrite CSS as well. This is why a lot of CSS-in-JS libraries came out and CSS modules became really popular because they solved some of that specificity problem and they gave you the ability to author more component-based CSS where your CSS lived in the same file as your JavaScript. Now, there was a lot of problems with these approaches, namely CSS and modules still dealt with specificity problems, and it made it really easy for you to modify things outside of your scope of your component. And generally, CSS and JS wasn't the most performant, and that's because it had to run all these calculations on the client to actually render what your CSS was. Then came along a lot of things like Tailwind CSS, more utility focused, and these are really great because there's no actual extra cost on the client to run this code since it's just normal CSS, but the problem is that it became difficult as your project scales to extend upon Tailwind CSS because it's really hard to overwrite existing classes on components. That's why things like Tailwind Merge and Class Variance Authority came out to try to solve those problems, but it's definitely not perfect. Now, the idea behind StyleX is to be the next evolution of CSS beyond Tailwind, beyond CSS and JS, and kind of taking the best of all those different things and combining them together. And I want to talk about what the core concepts of StyleX are before we actually dive into how to use it. So this Thinking in StyleX page, I'll link it in the description for you, is a great way to read through and kind of figure out what the core ideas behind this are. But if we just look at the table of contents, it gives you a really good overview of what you want. First, we have co-location, which just means your CSS is in the same place as where it's being applied. This is very similar to Tailwind and CSS and JS, where your CSS is directly inside the components where you want it to be. If we look at the code example I have on the side, you can see I have my styles defined right here, and they're being applied down below, so it's all in one single place, which is great. Now, this is something that's already really well solved by things like Tailwind and CSS and JS, but these next concepts are things that are a little bit trickier to do. For example, we have deterministic resolution, and we have type-safe styles. So the key between these two is deterministic resolution means that you don't have to worry about specificity. And that's because StyleX does not have any specificity at all. It's always going to apply whatever the last style you put on your element is. So if you specify margin in 10 different places, whatever the last time that you specify margin is, that's the one that's going to be applied. So it's really easy to make sure you properly overwrite things. And this is something a library like Tailwind Merge tries to solve, but it's just built into StyleX. And then we have type-safe styles. So everything is going to be TypeScript first. It's written in Flow and TypeScript, so you have great type safety no matter what typing you're using. And this makes it really nice because you have a lot of safety in regards to how you type out your code. You know that things are going to work, and it allows you to restrict people from passing certain props and so on, which we'll talk about later in this video. Now, the other main benefit to StyleX that they don't really talk about much in this table of contents, but they talk about more inside the actual article itself, is that it's really focused on performance. And that's because while you write all of this code inside of React, JavaScript, whatever it is, it can be used in any framework, it doesn't matter. You actually write it in JavaScript, but there's a compile build step that takes all of this code, completely removes it, and just replaces it with CSS and class names. So in the end of the day, you essentially get the exact same output as you would with Tailwind, where you just have HTML with class names and you have a CSS file, but you get the benefit of having all of this code in your JavaScript so you can get things like type safety built into it. This is, I think, where StyleX really goes beyond CSS and JS because most CSS and JS libraries run on the client, while StyleX does all of that building beforehand to give you the quickest page load time as possible. Now, with all that out of the way, we kind of know what the goals between StyleX are, so let's try to figure out how those goals actually work in the implementation. So we can close out of this and we can go over to our actual working code. And you can see in this very simple example, I have an H1 that I'm applying some styles to, and then I have a button component. And this button component is much more complex. Right now, it's essentially completely blank, but you can see I have the options to pass in things like a specific variant, whether or not it's a large button or not. And I need to style that button specifically based on those different props, as well as maybe other things that I want to pass in. So first, I want to talk about just a really simple use case of how this is used, because when you're using StyleX, there's really two main API functions you're going to use. There's StyleX.create, which allows you to create all the different styles you want. And then there's StyleX.props, which just allow you to apply those different styles to your element. So this looks probably pretty familiar if you're used to like CSS and JS, because as you can see, we're creating different classes almost, where I'm calling this a heading, and I'm saying the heading has a color of blue. I could add other stuff inside of here. For example, I could say my background color is going to be, let's say, black. And now if I give that a save, you can see it's a black background behind my heading element. And I can do a lot of different things inside of here for all my different CSS options. For example, I could add a margin of like 100 pixels. Now you can see there's a ton of different space around that element. So I can do all these different things inside of here, and I can even add extra styles if I want. For example, if I wanted to add styles for like a paragraph, or maybe I wanted to add like an active class, I could do that. And like the color here is going to be red, for example. As you can see, I can combine all these different things together. Then whenever you want to apply these styles, all you do is you call StyleX.props and you pass it in whatever styles you want to apply. So in my case, I'm applying just the heading style. So you can see that my heading is this blue color because that's what I specified here. Now, if I wanted to apply multiple different styles, I could also apply, for example, this active style. So I could say styles.active. Now you can see that my heading is actually red. But how does it know what color it's going to be, whether it's going to be blue or red? Because as you can see, if you're in normal CSS, the specificity for these would be essentially exactly the same. But in StyleX, it's always based on whatever you pass last. So the last thing that I pass to this props is the thing that overrides my style. And it just combines together all of these different styles. So for example, if I had here like a padding of 1 rem on this heading, you can see that that padding is still being applied while the active color is being applied as red and the padding is being applied from the heading. So it properly combines all of these together, and it always makes sure it applies whatever the last style is that you have inside the props, so you never have to worry about specificity. Now, the other important thing to note is that it doesn't actually matter if you're doing React, Vue, Svelte, normal JavaScript, TypeScript, whatever it is. This library works in any framework you can think of because it's just normal JavaScript code. So it's really up to you how you actually want to implement and use this inside your code. I'm just doing it in React because that's the easiest for me to use because I teach React already. Now this right here is the absolute bare bones most basic way that you can use StyleX. And if you're just looking at this, you may think that this is much more convoluted and complicated than something like Tailwind. And I 100% agree. This is much more code you have to write than something like Tailwind. But the benefits of this as your code grows becomes much easier because everything is in your JavaScript. You have type safety, you can share your code much easier, and some of the more advanced features I'm going to show you in a little bit really make this shine when you come to enterprise projects. Let's make our code a little bit more simple. We'll just kind of bring this back to what we had before. We just had a simple blue heading, and now I want to move into the button to show you how we would do some of this more complicated code with styling a component. So here we have a simple button component that takes in a variant of either primary or danger for like a red button, and then we have a boolean for is large, so I can show you how this works with strings and booleans and any other thing that you can think of. So obviously we want to create our styles very similar to how we did here where we created some styles. So I'm going to say const, I'm going to call this button styles. I'm going to call that StyleX.create. There we go. And we want to make sure when we do our import here, we actually import this as StyleX. We want to import it as star named StyleX, just like that. That way we get our import properly working. And inside of create, we obviously need to pass some stuff in here. So I'm going to put my base styles. This is the styles I want to apply to every single type of button. So what I can do is I can just paste in some styles. For example, I'm removing the border, the background, adding a little bit of padding, border radius, and making my cursor the pointer cursor. So now if I actually add these styles to my button by coming down here, I want to do that StyleX.props function. I'm going to pass it in my button styles.base as my very first style. Then we just need to spread this out. Now if we save, you can see that my button is showing up here. It completely removed border, background, everything else. And you can see that I have my cursor as a pointer cursor and I have some padding around the button. Now I want to actually apply the different styles for my variants. So I have a variant for primary and I have a variant for danger. So in my case, I'm just going to call a variant style here. And I'm going to come down and I'm going to call a danger style. Now you can name these things whatever you want. You can have any naming structure, but in my opinion, this works pretty well for what I'm trying to do because these are the different kinds of styles I want to apply. I want to either apply all the styles in this section or all the styles in this section. So for these different variants, I'm going to say here that my color is going to be white, and let's set my background color here to be a blue color. So this blue color right here. And now for my danger one, I'm going to do essentially the exact same thing, but my background color here, I'm just going to make entirely red. There we go. So now if we give that a quick save, you'll notice nothing is actually being applied to my button, and that's because I haven't used these styles anywhere. So what I want to do down here is actually apply those different styles. So what I can do is I can say my button styles dot, and I could say dot variant. And if I change this to actually say primary, because it should say primary instead of variant, there we go. You can see if I use primary down here, that is changing my button to blue. If I use danger, you can see it changes my button to that red color. And if I want to use this variable to determine which one I want, I can just come in here and use the simple bracket notation, pass in my variant, and now by default, the variant is primary. But if I pass in a prop here to say variant is equal to danger, you can now see my button has changed to that red color. Again, if you're looking at this code, you're thinking, well, this is kind of more complicated than just normal plain old Tailwind would be, and you are correct. But as you start to get more and more complexity added into your components, it becomes easier to write this with StyleX. And the real key here is, even if it's not easier to write, it's much easier to read and maintain than Tailwind, because changing complicated Tailwind code can become incredibly difficult, especially when you have to deal with merging of different things and conflicts between class names. So now what I want to do is I want to cover this is large section as well. So let's add in a large one here, and this will just be font size is going to be 2 rem. So we're just going to double the font size here. So now we can even apply those classes. So I can say if is large is true, then what I want to do is I want to apply those button styles dot large. There we go. So now you can see if I pass in this large prop, so I think I called it is large, there we go. You can now see that my button is much larger. We'll remove that because we don't really need the button to be that big, but you can see I'm just applying these different styles one after the other, and it's constantly just adding and merging them together. Now, if I, for example, had some type of border or background inside my base, that would be overridden by these primary ones here, as we saw with the heading example. But in my case, I just don't have a border or a background for the base style. Now, before I dive into some of the really cool features with StyleX, I do want to talk about one thing that's really cool about this that you can't do in pretty much any other library out there. Even normal CSS makes this difficult. Let's say that, for example, I want to come in here and my border radius is 0.25 em. But on my primary one, I actually want to remove that border radius. Well, what I could do is I could say border radius is going to be 0, and that will work. That'll technically remove my border radius. Let's move it down to the danger one. So as you can see, that border radius has been removed. But sometimes it's kind of difficult to actually make sure you default this to whatever the browser's default value is. And instead, what you can do is you can just pass in the value of null. And what that's going to do is it's just going to completely remove any styles that you've already passed in previous elements. So maybe I don't want my border radius to be 0. I just want it to be something else. I want it to be whatever the browser default would be. I can just pass in null here, and it's going to take care of that for me. Essentially, null just says completely remove this style from everything that I've used it in before. But if, for example, inside of my large one, I now want to add that border radius back in, I can say border radius is going to be, let's say 0.5 rem or something like that. Now, if I give that a save, you can see right now my border radius is removed completely because in danger it is set to null. But if I make this a large element, you can now see I have my border radius back. And the reason that this border radius is coming in is because first, my button style base is setting it to 0.25 em. Then my button style variant, which is danger, is removing it. And then finally, my is large is being added back in, which is adding this border radius. So it's constantly changing what the border radius is, but it's only going with the last specified value. So this is a really great way to be able to remove specific values that have been set in the past. Now, obviously I don't want this, so we're just going to get rid of this to bring our code back to what we had before, and we'll get rid of the large so that our button is at least a normal size. Now, one thing that is really hard to do in Tailwind without something like Tailwind Merge is how do you pass in custom styles? For example, I want to pass in some custom styles into here, and these custom styles I'm going to apply to my StyleX section here, and I'm just going to apply it at the very end, just like this. I'm going to say styles. Now, this styles is actually a type-safe thing that we can add, so I can say styles, and I want this to be from StyleX.styles. There we go. So this is just specifying that I have a specific style that is from this StyleX.create. So this allows me to pass along my own custom styles. So I can come into here. Let's say I want to create a button style. So I'm going to come in here, and also I should probably make this style optional in my type because I don't need to pass this along. There we go. That'll get rid of our errors. So I'm going to pass around a button, and this is going to have a background color of green. Just super straightforward. So what I can do inside of here is I can say I'm going to pass along my own custom style, which is just going to be styles.button. And now my button is green. Even though I have this variant of danger being set, again, it goes based on order. And since the last thing I pass in is my custom style, it overwrites everything that I had before. But what happens if I don't want to allow them to set a background color inside of these custom styles? Because it's already taken care of in the variant, so it shouldn't be something they can pass in that's a custom style. Well, what I can actually do is I can specify the exact styles they can or cannot apply. For example, if I only want them to be able to apply the margin style, I can come in here and I'm just going to say margin is a string. It's going to be an optional string. And that is the only div property that they can actually pass along. Now you can see we're getting an error inside of here because I'm trying to pass along this background color style, even though margin is the only one I'm allowed. So if I specify margin, for example, 10 pixels, and I remove background color, you can see now all of my prop errors go away. You can see that margin was properly applied. I can make it even larger so you can really see the button is pushed way down here. But as soon as I try to add something like background color in, I immediately am getting an error. Now, instead of specifying an exact thing like they can only pass margin, what if I wanted to say they can pass everything except for background color? Well, I could just come in here and use the without option instead. And now I can pass in background color. And here I want to essentially make this a type of unknown. There we go. So now if I give that a quick save, it's going to give me an error only if I try to pass a background color. So as long as I pass anything else, it doesn't matter what it is. If it's margin, for example, 10 pixels here, I could pass in padding of 10 pixels. That's going to work just fine, but I just cannot specify background color. As soon as I add the background color into here and I try to specify this as anything, I'm immediately going to be getting an error inside of my code. As you can see, I have this error right here. So this extra level of type safety is incredibly nice. I could even go so far as to say, let's say I want to allow them to only pass in the margin, and I only want them to be able to pass in specific values for the margin, such as 0, 2, or 4. So now the margin can only be these 3 specific values. So if I come in here and I try to pass in anything other than those values, for example, I try to pass in 1, I get an error. But if I pass in 2, you can see the error goes away. Now these are some amazing benefits, but some things that make this even better is how it deals with things like media queries and pseudo classes and so on. For example, right now our button doesn't have any hover state and it obviously should. So for now, what I want to do is I'm going to remove this custom styles typing. So it's just going to be normal. They can pass in any styles they want. That's perfectly fine. And now what I want to do down here is I want to specify what my background color is like on hover. What I can do is here where I pass my background color, I can pass it an object. And I can say that the default value is going to be what I had before, that 00AAFF. And now on hover, I want to specify a different color. So I'm going to come in here with a hover, and let's just say that I want this color to be black. So now if we change my button back to a primary button, so we can see how this works, when I hover this, you can see my button now changes to black on hover. I could do the exact same thing for focus. So I could say focus within, change that to black as well. So now if I tab onto the button, you can see I get that exact same black coloration showing up. And I can do this for anything, and I can even nest these as much as I want to. For example, I could put media queries inside of here as well. So for my background color, let's say that I have a media query where the prefers color scheme is going to be dark. Well, now I can specify, let's say now that the background color is going to be green. It really doesn't matter. And if I make sure I put an @ in front of here, so it's an actual media query, now what I can do is I can inspect my page, and all I can do is I can just click this button to change my prefers color scheme to dark. And you notice the button automatically changed to green when I'm in that dark mode, and it stays blue when I'm not inside of that dark mode. So it's really cool that all of these different features can work together, and I can even nest them further. For example, what I could do is here where I have the green, I could go a step further and say, you know what, I'm going to have a default, which is going to be green. And then I'm going to put a hover inside of here. So now I have my own hover inside of this media query. And in this case, I'm going to make the color something else, like let's say lime, for example. So now if I inspect my page, I'll change it back to that prefers color scheme dark. And when I hover, you can see it immediately changes to that much brighter, more obnoxious green color. And the great thing is you can do this with any media query, you can do it with supports properties and so much more. And if you want, you can even extract this out into a variable. We'll call this variable dark, and I can just come up here and say const dark is equal to this variable, and it makes it so it's a lot easier and reusable for your different media queries that you have. Now, the final thing that you may be noticing if you're looking at all of this that Tailwind does really well that so far StyleX doesn't is it has a really good built-in design system. For example, your padding can only be specified as like padding 0, padding 1, padding 2, padding 4. You can't just come in here and manually specify your padding as like 0.5 and a bunch of decimal places, because doing that makes your app inconsistent. And as your application scales, having a strong design system is really important. But StyleX has actually thought of that, and they have their own idea of implementing essentially your own design system directly inside of it by creating something called variables. These variables work pretty much exactly the same as creating a normal style, but it's a style that you can reuse anywhere you want in your application. So what I've done here is I've created this StyleX.defineVars function, and I've passed it in a primary color, which is going to be this blue color, and on dark screens, it's going to be this greenish color. Same thing here with primary dark, it's just going to be a darker version of blue and a darker version of green. I've also specified this border radius down here as well. Now to create these, the really important thing is that they must be inside of a .stylex.ts file. As you can see, my file is called tokens.stylex.ts or JS or whatever the file is actually called. Now, the reason for this is because what it does at compile time is it takes all this JavaScript code and it just converts it over to CSS variables. So if we want to implement these variables, what we can do inside of our button, for example, where we have border radius, is we could just say that we want to do our spacing dot, and we want to get our border radius from there, and that's going to apply that border radius property to our button. We got that right from here. I can also get my colors variable, and I can apply all the different colors I want to, for example, all these different default fields and so on. I'm actually just going to paste in what the final version of this would look like. As you can see here in our default style, we have our colors for the primary color. Hover, we have our primary dark, and on focus, we have our primary dark color. The really cool thing is, since our styles inside of here are already taking care of a dark and light mode for us, it's actually pre-styling all of those different things for us, so we don't have to worry about adding in our own dark and light mode because it's taken care of it for us right here with all these different media queries. Now you will notice in development, this has actually made my button disappear. This is because there's a bit of a problem right now with how I have StyleX set up inside of Vite, but if I actually build my application, we can see what the final version looks like. And if I drag this over, this is like a built finalized version. You can see we have my button right here. It's currently a large button. And if I inspect my page and I change to a darks theme, you can see I now have a green button that gets darker when I hover over top of it. And the really cool thing is if I inspect my page and I look at the actual sources tab, so we can go to the sources and we can look at the CSS. And if I open this up, you'll notice that inside of here, it's just a small CSS file, and it's usually mostly CSS variables. You can see all this code at the very top is CSS variables that are being defined for all the stuff that I have in that define variables section. And if we look at the actual button element by opening this up, you can see it just has a bunch of different class names being applied to it that are automatically created before the page actually gets compiled. So this is during compile time. There's no JavaScript that's running to assign these classes. It's just assigned for me. And then my CSS styles that are created take care of everything else. Now, if you wanted to have a dynamic style, that is something that is also supported. For example, if I wanted to come into here, I could create a dynamic style. By just coming down, I could say dynamic. It could be called whatever I want, but the key here is that this just must be a function, and now I can specify whatever I want, and I can take in like a value from here, and then I can specify, for example, my opacity is going to be whatever that value is that I pass in. And I just want to make sure I return this as an object. There we go. So now I can actually use that dynamic thing down here. For example, I could say button styles dynamic, and I could pass it in a specific value by saying like 0.5, for example, and now that's going to set my opacity to 0.5. Now to actually show this working, I'm just going to get rid of a lot of these styles that we had set with the tokens. That way we get rid of that. If we come over to here, you're going to notice we're actually getting a bit of an error. This is because of how early access this kind of thing is. If I actually want to make this work, instead of doing a return here, I must actually do this as an inline arrow function for the compiler to actually recognize this. So now if I do that and I save, you can see that that has worked. If I change my app button here to be the danger button, you now notice I have a 50% opacity. I could change this to 0.25. Now it's even more transparent. 0.75, it's less transparent. And this is something I could even take in through the props by passing in my opacity like this. And then I could use that opacity down here. So I could just say opacity. And then if I come over and I pass in opacity, let's just say I pass it in as 0.5. You can now see I have a 0.5 opacity button showing up. The only reason I'm getting these errors is because of TypeScript. So if I added that into my type here, opacity, which is a number, you can now see that should hopefully get rid of all those different typing errors. And this is something that's dynamic, so you can change it using state or anything else you want. So you have the ability to have dynamic values while also having the power of statically compiling everything beforehand for performance reasons. Now there's even more great features inside of here, such as the ability to create themes and do more complicated things with your styles and so on. But this covers really the majority of the things that you're going to use inside of StyleX. And I really think it could be a great alternative to something like Tailwind, especially on larger scale enterprise applications. I mean, the entirety of Facebook has been written in StyleX, and they've been able to make great improvements in reducing the size of their CSS while also making it easier to write and change in the future. Now, I really hope this library has you interested in trying out CSS again, and if you want to learn to really master CSS, I highly recommend checking out my Learn CSS Today course. It'll be linked down in the description below. This course covers everything you need to know about CSS, and it can be applied to Tailwind CSS, StyleX, or any other CSS library or framework that comes out, because it's just plain CSS and teaches you the core concepts you need to understand. So if you want to take your CSS skills to the next level, I highly recommend checking that course out, linked in the description below. And with that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.